Ooh. Oh man, that was cool. Oh, he's gonna feed us. Hi, how are you doing? Guess what we're talking about today? The interdependence of life. You know what I just saw? I love bird watching and nature watching. Out my front window here, I just saw a robin snag a worm, pull it right out of the ground, dangling. Ate it and got another one. He flew and he has his nest right here by my garage. And he flew the other one up to the little guys. And I have a nice, getting nice, green lawn. And that's only because of the earthworms. So you got earthworms in my soil, a lot of it. They're all over the place here, right? My grass, and the birds feed on those worms. The worms feed on the dirt. And they feed the little ones. The trees that die is what they built their nest out of. This is a wonderful cycle of life, right? This is what ecology is all about. You studied some about the animals, hopefully. I haven't. The earthworm, actually, that was one of the ones in the lab, right? And we had some plants. And this system kind of brings it all together. We've talked about photosynthesis and energy. So in ecology, we're going to have this lecture here just to kind of introduce the topic of ecology and the interdependence of life. There are many facets to it, but we're just going to cover in this lecture about 12 slides. It'll be about 15 minutes long. So here's some ecological terminology. You can spend some time here, but when we talk about ecology, we usually think of ecosystems. That has to do with the environment, and the environment is everything in it. All right, the surroundings of an organism, including the plants, animals, the microbes in the soil with which it interacts, and everything. So ecology is the study of how living organisms interact with the physical and the biological environments. When we say physical, we're talking rocks, dirt, usually water. So this term ecology comes from a German biologist, actually, back in 1800s, late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel coined the term ecology to study the environment. As natural philosophy began to get its legs as a science due to Mendel, mathematics, Darwin, there are many natural philosophers, Francis Bacon, William Paley. Anyway, the natural philosophy of life began to be a science of biology, and within that, those who just studied the environment and the organisms in it began to call it ecology. So biotic versus abiotic. Well, the abiotic, a meaning without or lacking. So those are non-living chemical and physical factors of the environment. Temperature, light, water, soil, nutrients that are in there. Biotic are the living organisms that are part of the environment. And population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same geographic area. So we have many populations in our yards, right? There's a population of squirrels. There is a population of rabbits. There's a population of sparrows and chickadees, right? So all together, the flowers in the garden or the grass growing, the trees in your yard, and those animals all make up the community. So a community is all the interacting populations living in the same geographic area. Okay, and every ecosystem can support only an amount of each population. You can't endlessly put in squirrels or rabbits or even trees, right? There's this balance. So ecosystem then is all the interacting communities of organisms. So the ecosystem of the community of my neighborhood might be a little different than a community on the other side of town. Probably not too much. Even as far as a couple hours, east or west or north and south. So this whole area, geographic region, would be considered an ecosystem. Okay, it's comprised of the community. But if you go far enough north, east, south, or west, you're going to start to see some plants you don't see here, some animals you don't find here. The terrain changes. Maybe it's a little flatter, not so Ozarkish. Well, then that ecosystem has changed, and ecology studies why. Why do cactus grow in Arizona, California, Nevada, but the further east they come, you see less and less cactus? What is it about the cactus population that it doesn't come into these other communities? So those are the questions we ask, and we learn a lot about organisms that way. Biosphere is the largest system. It's the global ecosystem, including all the Earth's regions that can support life, land, and water. It's the thin layer of Earth that supports life. All right, so ecosystems, all members of a community along with their physical and chemical environments. All right, so an ecosystem is composed of all interacting organisms. We call those a biota, along with their physical and chemical environments. The physical aspects of the ecosystem are called the abiotic components. They include variables related to temperature, sunlight, soil, and other factors that are non-living. All right, so they vary in size from microscopic environments like microhabitats, the soil. I just mentioned the soil. Now, the soil of Springfield may be a little different than the soil out in Bolivar. Not too much different in general, but there are some characteristics, which is why there's a whole science to farming and agriculture, because we got to see what you can grow and what your soil supports, or how you can amend the soil. So some ecologists then consider as well the biosphere as a global ecosystem, look at like climate change and things like this. So ecosystem diversity can be measured by the richness of genetic diversity within individual species. All right. So let's think about the boundaries again. The boundaries of an ecosystem are not usually distinct. So we don't see go from Ozarks to plain. I mean, there are those times we come down, say, from a mountain range and down in the valley is definitely going to be different than up on top. But for the most part, the boundaries are not usually distinct. And the activities of one ecosystem can often impact the other ecosystems. And some ecologists consider the biosphere as that global ecosystem that they look at. So the richness of genetic diversity, we talked a little about frequency of genes within individual species. We look at the number of different species present within the ecosystem and the variety of habitats that are there. Diverse ecosystems are believed to be more stable, more productive. It's harder to damage them. But energy and nutrients, all right, the chemicals continuously move through these ecosystems because animals move around, right? Because there's wind and rain. Because energy cannot be recycled, though, it's on a one-way in from the sun through the plant, eaten by the animal, and one animal by another animal, and eventually that energy is expended. We need that continuous input, and that's always usually going to be sunlight. So elements such as carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, and nitrogen, those are recycled within the ecosystem. That's matter. And those are through biogeochemical cycles, which we'll talk about later. But both energy and chemicals are transferred through photosynthesis, we've studied that, and feeding relationships. So the flow of carbon, which comes in from air, CO2, comes into the plant, and the plant converts that CO2 into a sugar, and animals eat it. Closely parallels the flow of energy through the entire biosphere. All right, so over long periods of time, ecosystems change in appearance and composition, and this is what you call succession. So succession is the regular replacement of populations in a habitat. Some communities may follow a recognizable sequence of change, ending in a relatively stable community referred to as climax communities. But recently, the concept of a climax community has generated a lot of debate, as the endpoints of a succession depend on the introduction of complex factors. So wildfires are natural. We've had a lot of fires we see in the news up northwest and out west, southwest. Some of those are natural fires, and organisms and some trees will not be able to propagate themselves until there is smoke or fire. That is their signal to reproduce. And if that never happens, they never reproduce, and those can die out. So sometimes when we know these things, we can have prescribed burns where they catch things on fire on purpose for a little while, but it's controlled. And something else can come in it, and that creates a new succession. Here's a couple over here. All right. Biomes. Here's some biomes. Tropical rainforests, savannas, deserts, temperate grasslands, deciduous forests, coniferous forests, Arctic tundra. What do you think we are most similarly? If you guess temperate deciduous forests, that's probably correct. Warm summers, cold to moderate winters, plentiful rainfall, as we've seen lately, rich soils. We got a lot of rock in ours. That's the limiting factor there. Hardwood and deciduous trees. They shed their leaves in winter, and the trees are characteristic of this biome type, temperate deciduous forest. That's the Missouri biome. Of course, if you go out towards Colorado, up to Montana, and further into Canada and Alaska, you get a lot of coniferous forest. North of that, you might get Arctic tundra. Of course, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, you'll get some of savannas. Go out further, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, you have deserts, and so it changes. Those are just some examples of biomes. Those are major, large regions. All right, so getting down from the major biomes, just looking at ecosystems. So each biome has within it several ecosystems. Okay, because there's water, there's lakes and rivers and ponds. So an aquatic ecosystem makes up probably the largest part of the biosphere. The term biome is based on a dominant vegetation and is not doesn't apply to the aquatic environments. But things like water depth, flow of water, whether it's still or flowing, the available light, the temperature, these are key factors in describing aquatic ecosystems. So flowing bodies of water, for instance, such as rivers, streams, and creeks, are influenced by excess water draining from the surface of land. All right, so depending on what's draining off the surface of land, you may have different nutrients, different algal blooms, bacterial populations, which will influence likewise the worms, crayfish, fish, frogs, big birds that eat them, and so on. So organisms are well adapted to the flow of water. Lakes have three major areas. There's the littoral zone, which is shallow near shore. Then there's the farther from shore, near the surface. They call it the limnetic zone. We'll look at each of these in turn. And then there's something we call the profundal zone. So it's deep, below light penetration. So the idea is just that even in an aquatic ecosystem, you have various areas where different organisms can exploit the food and habitat. Wetlands are some of the most productive, most efficient ecosystems. They're swamps, marshes, bogs, and they contain fresh, salty, or brackish water. That's a mixture. But they're very productive, and they're good breeding grounds for animals. Most animals are medium to small size, and they can get hidden in the reeds and the weeds and the grass, and there's water at the bottom of that. So you have all kinds of life there. Estuaries are fun. I used to live near an estuary. This is where the ocean meets, or rivers meet the ocean. So you have a little bit of each. On each side of the estuary, you have some freshwater organisms and you have some saltwater organisms. All right. So this is not about that, although that would be a good presentation as well. So this just takes you through some of those zones in the lakes. There's that photic zone. Light penetrates pretty well here. Benthic zone. Now this is more lakes and oceans. Limnitic zone. It's that surface. Littoral zone. We rely on thermal stratification in these lakes to bring nutrients up. So as dead things float down to the bottom, the water flow kind of overturns it. And you can look at the 4 seasons here, and that's pretty cool. And you see that as the temperatures change, as you go down lower in the different seasons versus evenly in the spring, and that constant thermal cycle, thermal stratification, make sure that there's a good mix of nutrients to support life year-round. All right. So, well, I will say also fish tend to exploit each of those levels. I'm going to stop there as the first part, and